This is really to follow up on what we were talking about before, which is about the audience segmentation that we've been looking at. I'm just going to give a bit of background for people who don't know. Hopefully the morning from the talk that you were given and the example from Singapore, you kind of know what audience segmentation is. It's basically a way of dividing groups of individuals that are similar in specific ways. So based on common characteristics, can be applied to consumers, businesses, can deal with both existing and potential customers, used to define and develop strategy for marketing and beyond. And we talked about the implications of segmentation as you apply it to other areas like programming and things like that. Traditionally aimed at identifying customers that will provide higher yield. Now, that's a very marketing approach, but obviously when we talk about higher yield, it doesn't mean about financial yield. It can be interpreted in many ways. And actually, one of the examples I showed where we talked about mosaic data was identifying who wasn't coming and the people who were from low-income families that we wanted to attract. How can you segment? We heard a little bit this morning about psychographic and behavioral, and then we have the traditional demographic and geographic. So we have things like age, gender, occupation, life stage, which I'm listing twice because it's partly down to demographics, but it's also down to behavioral things. Income, ethnicity, religion, language, location. But then we get into other ideas that are more occasion. You know, what occasions do people do it at? There are certain occasions in the year where people do activities. They become purchasers of something at Christmas, at Chinese New Year. They become purchasers. Benefit. What benefit do I get from doing it? It's really, what do I get out of it? It might be very varied. You know, and understand that. The loyalty and trust that people have in terms of what the offering is and to the brand. We hear a lot about brand loyalty. Certain brands, they do something, we feel loyal to them, we'll buy it. Apple always worked on the idea of heavy loyalty. Sometimes that trust allows them to, you know, do things that are slightly different and people trust it. Sometimes brands go beyond what their audience expects and people, you know, lose that trust or they don't think it really fits. Readiness to accept. This is all about, you know, how receptive people are to new ideas and to new things. And that's often set by certain conditions. For example, a good example in the arts will be, I might go and see a show if it's presented in a certain venue. I might, you know, it might be an experimental show in a very well-trusted venue. Alternatively, I might go and see a show that I would have thought would be quite dull if it's presented in a different thing. A lot of times you see productions of Shakespeare done in very exciting environments, and it brings in a whole new audience of people who would go, well, I wouldn't normally go and see Macbeth, but because it's in a disused power station, I'll give it a go. So attitude, you know, what people understand and what they want to do. Life stage, I've gone back to again because it mixes demographic and psychographic and behavioral. And frequency and volume, you know, how often people consume, you know, how much appetite they have for things, and whether they are kind of people who do it in bulk or spread out. So these behaviors. And how can it be applied in arts and culture? Targeting marketing messages, selecting channels, you know, what should you use? Direct mail, email, advertising. Checking representation in audiences against general population. How well does your audience reflect the overall population? And most of us have a duty to attract a wider group as possible. You know, we're not working in a commercial field where we can look at one sector and ignore other sectors. Identifying key segments for special attention. As I said, we did work looking at certain segments who were highly represented in London who weren't coming to shows. And we had to figure out what was going to make that happen. Sometimes it's been done through special language print to reach out to certain communities. Building audience-specific customer experience, tailoring customer experience. Simple things. I used to go to the cinema in the morning, on Sunday mornings with my baby, and they would do muffins, and I could park the stroller. Tailoring the experience to the audience for those Sunday morning film shows made a big difference. Developing digital strategy, user experience and personalization, this idea of personalizing things for specific needs. So recognizing whether you've been before or are new, where you're viewing in from. Supporting fundraising, obviously, the more you know, the more you can ask. programming strategy, scheduling, pricing that can be influenced by certain sectors, developing concessions, discounts policy, and sales predictions and patterns, logging and understanding how customers behave, who will book early, who will book late. So there's lots of ways it can be applied, and there's probably countless more, and there are lots of examples of how these things have been applied. So I'll go quickly through this because I think we get an idea what a segmentation model is, but I thought it was useful for everybody who's looking at this area to understand what's already been done. So Mosaic is one thing I referred to before. This is a segmentation model that's been used in the UK for many years. It includes data on 49 million people. It's a very, very rich set of data. And the reason is because the company who do it, Experian, control all the credit ratings for everybody, for their credit cards. So they draw together huge amounts of data. It's a massive data set, and it was used quite a lot in lots of art studies. So, for example, I showed this before. You can see the different groups, symbols of success. This is how many live in London. This is how many as a percentage, go to theatre. Urban intelligence, segments. And then we see other groups who aren't very well represented at all in the sectors. The downside of these kind of models is they do actually encourage you always to go for the people who have the highest yield. They say, here are more of these people, keep getting them, rather than go, well, what do I do about these people and these people? People get very lazy and concentrate on the groups that are already preconditioned to come. And you end up with these groupings. So this is a typical segmentation grouping of people who are symbols of success. And these are obviously very successful, wealthy people, and everything's good for them. Urban intelligence, another grouping that you see, which is more living in more urban areas, younger professionals. And the interesting about Mosaic is the fact that it can then be divided down into types. Mosaic has something like, I think, 46 types that it can be divided in. And then it can delve down even deeper and start breaking down between the kind of subgroups that perform very well. And they go deeper into it. And you end up with these types of people who actually, to be honest, always sound fairly loathsome. They always have really kind of like sound very, very wealthy and smug. But how it can be applied, I mean, again, this is something that applies these different groupings of segments and just recognize the differences. So we take a grouping here, a segment, countercultural mix, and we compare 3 different shows. And we can start to see the different audiences who go to different shows. Just so everyone knows, because again, we're real, there is actually Mosaic for Hong Kong. It does exist. The difficult thing is it has none of the data that makes the one in the UK really, really work. It's based on census data. It doesn't really have any other data added to it. So it's not particularly resource strong. The other thing is Mosaic is a geographically based model. It's based on postcode sectors in the UK. In Hong Kong, you don't have postcodes. So it's not really, really applicable very, very well. It divides Hong Kong into 29 types in 10 groups. And I thought for any of you who hasn't seen it, these are the Mosaic groups for Hong Kong, which similarly start with this very, very kind of slightly disturbing class approach, because you see up there A01 is expats and the privileged. And then you're going down into this sort of idea. So it sort of doesn't really quite cover what you're looking for in a segmentation model. Because the other realizing you'll notice, if I showed you the Mosaic model, what was interesting was certain groups performed well for dance, but they perform well for all arts. So everybody from those groups goes to the arts. The only question is you don't know which thing they go to. They're all going to the same kind of, they're all going to see theatre, they're all going to see dance, but as the data also shows, most people are only going to one venue. So they're choosing a venue and just going to that venue again and again. Other segment models, just to talk about this. This is one that has been developed in the UK, Morris Hargreaves McIntyre's culture segments. Again, if you want to look it up, there are a lot of resources online to look at this and get background on it. It's been used quite a lot around the world. It's actually been applied in China. The British Council applied it in China. the interesting about this model is this very much is based on, similarly we're talking about an example in Singapore, very much on people's behavioral but emotional responses. So it has things like, you know, perspective, expression, entertainment, enrichment, stimulation, affirmation, release, essence. It's very, and the reason it's quite generalized, I think, is because they try and apply it across a wide range of places. And it's useful if it's supplemented by additional data. If you've got a rich data set, you could apply it to this and then fill in those missing gaps. And this is one that was developed by Audiences London for the Arts Council, which is Arts Audiences Insight. Now, this has been replaced by a new model, but I do like this one. What I've always liked about this one is the fact that it recognizes the fact there are people who are highly engaged, some engagement, not currently engaged. It recognizes there's a whole group of people here who are interested in participating rather than going. They're passionate about the arts, but they actually participate more than they go. This is the, and I think you'd recognize some of these groups. I don't know if there's a Hong Kong equivalent, bedroom DJs. These are the guys who spend hours practicing at home on their mixing, but never DJ in a club, but they really, really get into it. Midlife hobbyists, these are the older guys and who take up photography, the women who start doing gardening very heavily or art. You know, retired arts and crafts, these people who these are recognizable groups that exist. And there are other things recognizing why people do it. You have these people who traditionally go a lot, but you have other people who go, they want to go with friends, these people who like a nice evening out once in a while, have a dinner, have a show, something special. And then there are other people who aren't really engaged. So this one has been replaced by a newer version, but the hierarchy element was interesting in terms of engagement, because I think the important point about any arts-based segmentation approach has to always recognize that everybody is a potential customer audience member. I think it's always best to start from that approach, to consider how you can go out and engage people. So applying segmentation to Hong Kong, when we were looking into it, it was quite obvious that Hong Kong, the challenges were there isn't a huge amount of data to draw from. Also, as a city, it's a very, very rich, vibrant city. There's a lot of details to it. So applying another model didn't really, so it seemed sense that we took the best of these ideas and we then go, how do we develop something which is trying to make it more deeper, bearing in mind we will have to apply data to it afterwards, not start with the data first. If I could start with a massive data set, you could do lots of work analyzing, but here you're starting with effectively nothing. We want the segments to be relevant, distinguishable, sizable, locatable. There's no point if they're not, because if you can't find the segments, you can't recognize them. I say cities present challenges. I mean, segmentation in London is very different from segmentation outside of London. Hong Kong is very unique. It needs to be meaningful and manageable, it has to be usable, and needs to convey each different audience's expectations and needs, i.e. what do they want from it. I think it's very important. It has to be clear enough that when you see the segments, they make sense into understanding who they are and what they want from you and what you want to give them. So, what we've done is a pilot study conducted by Acorn, and we have Derek here from Acorn, who are a very, very well-respected international company, but very Asia-focused, have an office in Hong Kong, but you're originally Singapore-based, isn't it? Yeah. And there was a methodology which we developed based on the idea that we didn't have much data to start with, which was the fact we went to focus groups, set up focus groups to start to kind of ideas of what we could have as a hypothesis, and then follow through doing sampling, questionnaires using phone and face-to-face interviews. And the aim really was, in terms of the recruitment, was the idea that it was aimed at being very inclusive. So there was a very, very low barrier to taking part, which I think was based on going once in the past.
Actually, the interviews themselves are basically encompassing all the people who are interested in the art form.
Yeah, without. Yeah. So it was really trying to get this idea of going, how can we be as inclusive as possible in the study? And the idea of this is to try out this idea and see how it could possibly be used as a sector-wide segmentation model and how it could be further refined. So I showed this slide before, number of questions that were asked. Obviously, you have the green ones, which are the demographic ones, gender, age, monthly income, marital status, this kind of stuff, which some of this is asked often in questionnaires, some things aren't always asked. Then we have about people's habits, frequency of attending, interest level, what do they want to attend, where are they going with their group size, spending, and then this understanding of the venues that exist, how they like to be communicated with, and their attitudes towards life and attitudes towards culture. So this element is very much this sort of psychographic behavioral element mixed in. So going back to the question, I think this gentleman over here was asking about? Maybe was you asking, you were talking about the mixing of the different elements between demographic, behavioral, life stage. Because of that challenge, we were trying from the beginning to kind of combine these ideas together. So I'll just go to the end of that bit. So out of the sample, just to summarize a bit of data, we had, in terms of those people who, 94% had attended before, 64% in the past year, 36% attended in the past 3 months. Now, actually, I mean, in the UK, I mean, actually, even for a regular attender is someone who actually has gone in the last 12 months, because attendance is actually never as frequent as people actually imagine. It's actually quite surprisingly low. People imagine they go to the theatre much more than they actually do. And then looking at ideas of interest level in terms of their interest in art forms and their attending fees, because there can actually be quite a lot of discrepancy between these ideas and understanding what their attitude as opposed to what they actually really do. And so on that basis, there are a number of segments who are identified. And we had to come up with names for them. So the names are our working labels. But the idea is some of these names are going to stay and some may change. I think that obviously you have certain things, you're thrifty, traditional C2 fans, I think you can probably kind of guess. Open-minded seniors, I think people kind of would know. Non-attending mainstream interests, midlife explorers, dedicated arts enthusiasts. This one is quite interesting, this grouping. Actually, sophisticated taste. This one actually is quite, it's quite an interesting one, and it's quite fun to actually, look at that group. And then we have the younger groups, who are really vary in terms of their level of interest. And the interesting thing was about what their attitude was. And there were some subtle differences that came out. Obviously, as part of that, within the groupings, there are some obvious differences that come out in terms of people's income, where they stand, and obviously we talked about this group who have a large amount of income, and what that really means. So we'll give a sample of, I'm going to give a sample of one kind of data sheet just to get an idea. So so far in terms of what we've done, each one includes a description. This is for budding culture grazers. This is a description of what they think and like, that came out of the process. Their attitudes towards life, ratings of what they think, attitudes towards arts and culture. So these statements are really there as questions to kind of help find a way of judging people's attitudes. A good way of describing this would be, a simple thing would be, if you go to an art exhibition, there are some people who go to an art exhibition quite clearly because they feel it's the place that they should be, because the opening of an art gallery is fun and they get champagne and and it's the place to be seen. Other people go because they passionately care about the art. It's a very, very different thing. People have very different motivations of why they do certain things. So we're trying to understand why they do it, what it is. So some of these questions are things that come up quite revealing. I mean, enriches my cultural knowledge, broadens outlook, going to museums because of the atmosphere, the role in child's development. What do they think? I mean, actually, there's not enough good performance in exhibition venues in Hong Kong. And a number of different people said this, but it was interesting. They say it for different reasons. When they go abroad, do they visit museums? It helps me improve my knowledge and understanding. So there's trying to kind of get a sense, and different people's attitudes give a sense of their motivations and why they're doing things. And while that all might seem a little bit vague and wishy-washy, there is also backed up by more focused data, which is very much based on understanding a bit between the gender balance, the age, the income, their marital status, their education, what kind of things that group specifically does, their experience in other countries, which turned out to be a significant factor for some groups in terms of their exposure to risk and different ideas. What do they attend? This is based on their last 2 occasions. Who are they going with? Certain groups tend to grow with other people, with large groups, other people go with just one other. Their spending and their motivation. Going back to this idea of motivation, what made them do it? Trying to kind of understand what are the main drivers of why they do it. Looking at it from different aspects of it. So what they gain from it intellectually, emotionally, socially. And for some people, different things pull more. A lot of people will go to arts and culture. I'm one of these people sometimes, to be honest. My wife even more so. She will go to lots of things she doesn't even like because her friends will go. It's something to do with her friends. She quite enjoys it. Me, I might do that up to a point, but then I'll go, no, I really don't want to be there. So it's just interesting how different people's attitudes are, and this again affects things like the risk and the trust they put in stuff. So basically, we were looking at some of this stuff to give a full picture, and it is a relatively, detailed picture of people. And then we asked them about their awareness of the different venues, looking for venues within the groups that were significantly well known, which ones people had heard of, which one they visited, which one they would go back to, just to understand a little bit more about their behaviors and see within the context of the venues which ones they feel most familiar with. And then again, looking at what people's habits were in terms of how they like to be communicated with. And the important point about this is also about finding differences. Not everyone can like everything the same. The important point is we're looking for the differences, and those differences form the basis of the groups. By looking for differences across all those factors, we can then kind of group things together and go, well, we think these. Now, this is not exhaustive because, as I say, typically it would be based on a large amount of data we would hold from existing audiences to help validate these ideas. This is based on the idea that people are, through interviews, disclosing. So we can't guarantee how 100% accurate it is. But over time, we would hope to supplement this with other data that will give a fuller idea of people's how accurately these reflect the different groups, and whether these groups are, all that exists, or whether they could be further subdivided, how they might react to different art forms, or whether there were, lots of questions that could be asked. So what I'll do is I'll just go through the different segments, actually. So we talked about budding cultural grazers. The youngest of all the segments, mostly students with limited means, but not stingy when it comes to attending performances and shows, even though they tend to attend mostly free events and exhibitions. Socially active, they disregard what others may think of them, and conscious of their own independent, unique image. A highly absorbing sponge, this segment has a wide repertoire of interests and are interested in knowing and being exposed to more, to have a broader outlook. Then we have another group, which is another young group, social entertainment seekers. Fresh career chasers who see arts and culture more as entertainment, as a means to have more fun and variation in life, hence not particularly attached to any art form. Reliant on others' recommendations, what's hot in what's other people are talking about, events appeal to them as a social gathering for fun, which they will attend with a large group of friends. A lot of things that come out of this, these sort of things, is quite common, is what makes people go. Some people like to go and see something because they feel assured by it, because other people have told them about it. And they also want to tell other people. If I tell you about someone you've never heard of, it's not that exciting. If I tell you about someone you've heard of, you at least can be interested. Other people like to be the people who... This goes back to the classic adoption cycle of the people who are early adopters and the early majority and things like that. The idea that some people are more open to these things and want to be on the cutting edge. Other people feel more secure knowing that they're going to get something that has a value. We found this issue in dance when we were selling contemporary dance about risk, because you had to recognize the risk was a double risk. If I'm going to a piece of dance, there's a risk if I'm going to enjoy it, but it's a double risk. I'm taking someone with me. I've got to persuade someone to come and see a bit of contemporary dance. So the risk is actually there as well. And one of the interesting things was how we could mitigate that risk by giving them information to explain that they would say, well, there's a show on at Sadler's Wells. I don't know. It seems pretty strange. It's going to have naked people running around. They're going to be doing this and that. Someone climbs into a washing machine. It's really hard to explain. And there's a video, but you could watch it. Have a look at the video. I don't know, but it should be interesting. And then that's what you had to do. Give people the tools to communicate with other people. It's not a single journey. It's often about how you get other people to... Because the strongest way of marketing anything is word of mouth. That's always what happens. Performance explorers, often young single women with white-collar occupations who enjoy their social life with friends and family. Interested in dance and body movement performances, and as a participatory hobby, they would travel abroad for certain scheduled arts events. Overseas, they find arts and culture broadens their outlook and offers an insight into different cultures and walks of life. Passive indifferent, mid-aged, single with modest income, secondary education level, middle level of interest across art forms except pop music, see arts and culture as too boring or too abstract for them to understand, hence they're unwilling to spend money on it. They complain about the lack of performance venues in Hong Kong, though they are indifferent to arts and culture themselves. Now, I've actually seen this manifested quite a lot in other environments where people go, oh, I don't know, it's too difficult to get tickets. Oh, it's always sold out. I don't really like, and actually it's a way of explaining why people don't want to go. However, they do recognise it's an important part in a child's development. It's good for children to do it, just not what they would do. Dedicated arts enthusiasts, and these are getting to the groups that you probably see quite a lot of. Health and wellness conscious, characterised by its better educational, occupational, financial status. One of the most active segments across a wide spectrum of arts and cultural activities, including traditional Chinese art forms. Outdoor arts and cultural events appeal to them, inspired by talent and appreciative of quality performance, willing to pay for special experiences. A high proportion of these people had experience of living in other countries. Sophisticated taste, which is a different group. Highest household income, second highest personal income, similar to the dedicated arts enthusiasts, but more sophisticated than dedicated. They're not really as dedicated. They don't go anywhere near as much. They're more sophisticated. They like to believe that they know. Not as inclusive of Chinese cultured art forms as Western art forms, particularly classical ones. Western classical means Western opera. When in Hong Kong or travelling abroad, they visit museums to enjoy a tranquil cultural atmosphere. They find time immersed in classical art and cultural performances and exhibitions helps them reflect on and improve their inner well-being. There's a sort of similar group that exists in the UK amongst very wealthy people. They actually end up often on boards of arts organisations in the UK, bizarrely enough. And they always tell you about what you should have seen. Midlife explorers, mid-aged in their 40s with a decent income, less involved in the previous two groups in arts and culture. Nonetheless, they have wide interests, like to discuss what they've seen with others. So with social media or on long-term friends, they trust word of mouth more than advertising and are more confident with things that have a proven track record on popularity. Attending arts and culture helps this segment to unwind, recharge and de-stress so they can have some private moments with their family to disconnect from daily life. Non-attending mainstream interests. Highest personal income segment, nearing their 50s, arts attending frequencies are among the lowest within the same band of life stage. Their interests in arts and culture are mainly in contemporary music, theatrical plays and art exhibitions, all of which are rather mainstream entertainment. Overseas living experience has not made them more receptive to arts and culture at an earlier life stage. But now, with the means, when they travel overseas, they would visit well-known museums and major arts activities. In Hong Kong, they attribute their lukewarm interest in arts and culture to the lack of good venues. And then we have the final two groups, senior. Open-minded seniors, I think I see quite a lot of these around Hong Kong. Better means than the next group. Female-driven, elderly segment, interested in traditional Chinese arts as well as contemporary music performances. Freshly into their 60s, they see the arts as enriching their understanding of their cultural heritage. Besides traditional Chinese theatre, they're interested in Western classical theatre and opera. And then the last group, thrifty traditional Sichu fans. An elderly segment of retirees in their 60s, they believe arts and culture is more for the next generation, as arts plays an important role in child's development, as with their grandchildren, who they would probably take to see things. They do not see themselves with the extra money available to spend on arts and culture. To them, old is always better than new. The most relevant art forms are traditional Chinese opera, but they do not attend those performances a lot. Most of the time, tickets were either given by someone else or when there were 3 performances. If they go, they would go with family. They would occasionally go alone if it's a free show. So we have 10 groups that we've identified. There may well be more, and some of those groups could possibly... At one point we were looking at 8 groups, and in the end when we looked at it, it felt that there were actually 10. So it's a case of just trying to kind of go, okay, we suspect these groups exist, and then going forward, it will be a case of applying the data to do this, to actually tease these out more through a process of focus groups, through a process of applying research. For example, we have, through application of certain questions that could be rolled into other things through registrations and things like that, we can then start to assign people to these groups. And then, of course, once you see these as segments, the important point is it becomes clear that one message does not really work to all. You have to think about the idea of how would that maybe potentially impact on the messaging you would give. So, before I do that, let's go back. Any questions? Anyone want to ask any questions now? Anything didn't make sense? So this is the first time we've done it. It's the very first time we've done it. Obviously, and the aim is that, as I say, we will just add to it and supplement it. And as I say, we'll work with other companies because we need access to understand other audiences, how it applies to different art forms. Because really, this is very much an overview of arts attendance. And we've asked people about their particular interests. But to understand more about that, we need to do more work. So it's really the first stage as a pilot to do this. But because there isn't really any, that I've come across, any audience segmentation that exists, it seems to make sense that we kind of start with this as an idea and then delve into it.
So basically these segmentations are before making statements, right?
Yeah. So this is segmentation of people's general arts and cultural habits in Hong Kong. Okay. Hello.
Hi. You're talking about general segments across the sector. How are you, you've got a plan of how to coordinate between different organisations in terms of creating data that backs up what people are saying in these interviews?
Well, this is obviously, as we talked, data is always, it's the biggest challenge of how we go forward to the next step. As I say, normally in the past, you would actually, either you would have access to a large data set anyway, and then you would try and implement things through, let's say, ticket booking processes, certain key questions that you could ask. Here, we're going to have to take a little bit more of a slower approach. So this is why we want to work in terms of, we'll do a series of focus groups where hopefully organizations or sectors can at least reach out to groups of people in their audience and invite them to take part in focus groups. So we can do a further level of interrogation, and and we're looking at different ways it could be done. One could be we take art form. Let's say we take something like dance, and then we draw audiences from different who go to different dance companies, and we look at it sector-wide, or we can delve in it by specific companies. At the moment, we're focusing more on sectors. So the next one what areas we want to look at in more depth would be dance, gallery attendance, free events, because there's a lot of free outdoor events happening, and also small and medium scale theatre. And then look across those to try and see how well, because this is really kind of, you have to then see how does it actually match up to reality. So that would be what we'll try and do next. Any other questions? Hello. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what's the timescale of this survey? It's a very detailed survey, and I just saw 3,000 interviews. And what are the challenges gentlemen would take on? And it is a very, very detailed and actually sophisticated survey. I wonder how much work that's gone into that. It's a huge, big piece.
Well, I think, a lot of work has had to go into it, but I think that the important thing about working with a professional, research agency is they have very, very clear methodologies and processes. I think the biggest issue was we had to do a certain amount of understanding of the nature of arts and culture, with the peculiarities of that, because, as I say, it's a very, very detailed segment. And even though there are common behaviors across the art forms, the diversity within it, that's just why things like mosaic has never worked for me, because it identifies a segment, and it might work well. It might tell you that you like, from a consumer, it might tell you like wine, but it can't tell you what kind of wine you like. Here, we know certain people go to arts and culture, but I don't know, whether they've happened to be interested more in this art form or that art form. It's very, very, that's one of the challenges. So there was quite a lot of work to sort of establish that. But I think in terms of the actual recruitment methodology and stuff, do you want to say? Yeah.
Oh, I can take this one. This one? Yeah, actually this one we started last year, 2016. Quarter one, we started working on this project. And we all started with focus groups, okay? That's how we defined the, what we call the important psychographic and attitudinal statements across the population with interest in art and cultural activities in our city. So one of the early questions about like the coverage of the study, the research that we did, we are not only looking at those people who have attended or who are attending any forms of art and cultural events. We are in fact focusing on those people who are showing interest even without attending or without having attended any events before this. That's why one of the charts that Kingsley was just showing in the presentation that you saw, only 97%, well, I shouldn't say only, but it's not 100%. 94% of the respondents in our survey actually had attended art or cultural events ever in their life. 6% had never done that, but we still included them. Most of these people are interested individuals in any form of art forms, but due to area of reasons, they had not attended any of those performances. So the coverage of this study is actually not 100% of the population, but I would say quite a good deal of the population, where you have people who are interested in any form of art and cultural activities, including pop music, as Kingsley has just mentioned. So the universe in this study is quite big, it's quite comprehensive. Now going to the question that this gentleman has just raised, a lot of work had gone into it. We started with the focus groups to define the attitudinals and the psychographical statements that are relevant to their choice, to their preference in art forms or interest in art and culture. Then we turned that into a quantitative analysis study with online, telephone, and face-to-face surveys. That's where the 3,000 people came in as a representative sample of the population that we are talking about. The research was done in last year, quarter two, and then we finalized our finding with what Kingsley has just presented to us, the 10 segments, in Q4 last year. So it's very new, it's very fresh. And one last remark regarding one of the questions from the lady in the front about how often do we need to do this kind of study. It very much depends on how dynamic the market is, the change of the audience. Are we likely to see a lot of changes in this market? Are we likely to see a lot of changing dynamics in the mindset of the audience? That's the key criteria in determining how long or how often we should revisit this segmentation study.
Okay, so there is a workshop element to this. So basically what we really wanted everyone to do was we're going to divide everybody up. Oh, sorry, do you want to ask a question? Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions for that. One is, the groups or the venue or the artists able to share the data with
Okay. Okay.
And the second question is it an open system? Let's do maybe for one organization, maybe I have to apply different, like the artists or ticket. Is it an inclusive, exclusive system or an open system? What is the data?
Okay, because everyone always asks the same question, so I'll give the same answer I always do. There are rules and laws that cover data, yes? Before everyone starts asking about data, that's quite straightforward. There are laws and rules that cover this. We can't hand data out in anything like that. There are systems of permissions for people to have access to data. If we don't follow those, I'll probably end up going to prison, and I'm not going to go to prison. It's quite as simple as that, yeah? Because it'll probably my name will be down as data privacy officer. So the interesting thing is the fact that yes, we will have ability for permissions for people to sign up for whatever there is. The other important point, which I've said, is the fact that when we talk about anonymous data, there is a huge amount that can be done with that data. By anonymizing it, in terms of insights and everything like that, you can provide that information to actually allow people to understand what audiences are doing, what their crossover is. So we would want to share that information as wide as possible. When it comes to actually, if the main objective is just to go, can I have my customers so I can then email them or do something to them, then that's the issue really. It's not my data and it's not your data, it's the customer's data. So the customer decides. If they want to actually hear directly from you, that's a customer-led decision. We had a very good conversation talking about, in terms of Hong Kong Ballet, and we talked about this, the idea of what they, because they are the same question, and they're talking about the relationship with a ballet company is different to a relationship with the theatre. The theatre is telling you what's happening in the next month, 2 months, 3 months. We have to tell them that. The relationship with the ballet company is derived from the idea of telling you who the casting is, when you can come to a special rehearsal, all the other background information. So there has to be a clear, there's a difference in venues and things like that. But at the end of the day, the system, absolutely, there's the ability to provide insights, the ability for people to log into the system and maybe and potentially make reservations and bookings directly is possible. But there has to be, at one point, a centralized approach to the data ownership. Otherwise, to be honest with you, you won't be able to do anything with the data. Because ultimately, the clearest issue that's going to define how much we're able to do is about responsible use of data and ensuring that no one gets anything that they didn't know they were going to get. And if you don't, then quite clearly there are a number of things that will stop you doing anything with data at all. Because we're judged not just by what we do, but anything to do with direct marketing, for example, is judged by the standards across the whole industry. And any complaints that come have a reflection on it because it's all driven by a centralized policy. So this is one of the things. But certainly, absolutely, if people buy a ticket for a company and they opt in, then they would do it. Now, there are certain things I would say, as we're talking about this, about responsibilities in that way, because it's still customers' data. I have a good example, which I actually gave earlier on. We had data, we had an opt-in for another company. That company were written to by the parents of the woman who was on the list, saying, my child died. Please remove me from the mailing list. Now, the question is, do they have a duty to tell us that that person has opted out of that list or not? Now, legally, they don't have a duty, but as a customer, I feel, we should take responsibility. So there has to be understandings of how data could be corrected. Otherwise, you could easily get to a stage where customers will get very, very antagonized. And there has to be a protocol that manages how data is used. Otherwise, you will get people getting bombarded with messages again and again. So with data, with great data comes great responsibility.